Okie doke.
Awesome. It is great to see everyone this afternoon. My name is Drea, and I welcome you to the panel discussion, First Gen Identity and Resilience in Pop Culture Narratives. I first just want to say I'm delighted to welcome everyone into this space. We're going to have a wonderful discussion. And I just, folks who know me, I want to name the realness of the situation that we're confronting. We are battling and facing many different stressors in our lives, in our academic experiences, and our personal experiences, and our social experiences. And as we journey through, our own adventures here, we also understand that this can be a discouraging and stressful time. And so I hope that as I look around the room and as I look at my speakers here, I'm very encouraged to know that we continue to be resilient, we continue to be innovative, and we use our ingenuity and our ability to uplift voices and to also carry discussions just like this one, to think differently about how to get ourselves out of hard situations, and how to highlight and champion the strengths in us, the good in us. So with that, I'm very delighted to be a part of this discussion as the moderator. What I'm going to do is first give a bio for our speakers, and then I'm going to ask them to share their favorite fandom. So I'm going to start with Dr. Martha Enciso, who is the Associate Director of the Weber Honors College at San Diego State University. In her role, Dr. Enciso assists in recruiting underrepresented students, mentoring, teaching, and in scholar development in high-impact practices. Dr. Enciso is the co-chair of the SDSU First Generation Student Success Campus-wide Initiative and assists with the Transfer Student Achievement Initiative. She has experience working in cultural centers, international education, student retention, diversity initiatives, and with transfer students, as well as first-gen college students. Dr. Enciso presents her work nationally and serves on national leadership teams for the professional associations such as NASPA. Martha, what is your fandom?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So I would have to say that my fandom would have to be Wonder Woman, and comic strip wise though, and not in the traditional book sense, or was later adapted into books. For those Spanishers in this space, Mafalda would have to be my other fandom growing up.
I love Mafalda. Next up is Amanda Igloff, who is a first-gen college nursing PhD student at the University of California, San Francisco. Amanda studies how nurses work with medication administration technologies. Amanda is a retired U.S. Navy nurse and previous aviation rescue swimmer, serving 17 years in the military. She builds on these experiences as the framework in researching safety systems in healthcare. Amanda hails from Louisiana and has lived all over the U.S. What is your fandom?
Oh, what is my fandom?
Or fandom?
Star Wars is my total jam. Yeah.
Representing Star Wars. Awesome. And I'm also joined by my colleague, a proud first-gen college graduate, Latanya, also known as LT Rease Miles, who is a PhD and is the executive director of the first-year experience in strategic initiatives at UCLA. Her responsibilities include collaborating with various units across campus, such as student affairs, enrollment management, and alumni affairs, to strengthen and enhance the experience of first-year students. This includes overseeing signature programs such as Welcome Week, targeting particular populations to increase their engagement at the university, and educating the campus about first-year students. In this capacity, LT has pioneered initiatives for commuters, out-of-state students, and students from rural areas and small towns. Additionally, LT is an expert presenter, panelist, and keynote speaker, as well as the creator, the OG initiator, the creator and pioneer of Empowering First-Gen College Students, a national Facebook page. LT is also the founder of the University of California First Generation Consortium and a founder of the National Black First Gen Collective. LT, what's your fandom?
I have a couple. I also have, this guy is hiding in the background. I don't know what his deal is, but
He
this
can
is
join us.
yeah, I don't know, he's acting weird today. So The Flash, for sure. And although I am not a Harry Potter fan, I am a proud Ravenclaw, which is probably the most Ravenclaw thing one could ever say. And I want to acknowledge that San Diego Comic-Con is happening this week, and I'm representing for Batgirls today. There's an awesome panel that folks can have access to free, yay, so check it out, featuring our moderator, Drea.
Thanks for that plug, I appreciate it. And I'm your moderator. My name is Drea. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist at UCLA. I'm the interim director of our Student Resilience Center and the associate director of mental health training, intervention, and response for residential life. I'm also in my superhero identity. I'm a consultant for writers and creators. You can find some of my work as in my on-camera interviews for shows like Gotham, The Flash, and some other Warner Brothers like featurettes and bonus features. I'm also the host of a podcast called the Arkham Sessions, which is all about the psychology of Batman. And then you can check out my TEDx talk with UCLA called Capes, Cowls, and Courage, which is all about my own journey with imposter syndrome and superhero identity. So please check that out. My fandoms, I have so many, include Batman, Star Wars, anything DC, Marvel, and a little bit of Star Trek. With that, I want to throw this over to Martha and ask, we're talking about the first gen identity. Real talk here. When I was a first gen student, I did not know that I was first gen. So discovering that this identity exists and there are others like me was an encounter that really meant a lot to me. Can you define first generation for us?
Sure. I think the trouble with trying to help first gen students and help them identify who they are is that there's so many different definitions for first gen. There's no one kind of universal one, but there are certain characteristics that are very prominent within the first gen group. So a lot of them, like we're saying today, they're very resilient. It tends to be students who may be the first in their family to receive a 4-year degree from an institution in the US. So we do have students who have parents who have degrees from other countries, students who may not be the first to attend, but they will be the first to finish. So, and there's also kind of the experiences of being the first to live in the residence halls, being the first to take a standardized test exam. So there's a lot of nuances. But similar to yourself, Drea, I was not aware of the term in regards to the experiences I was having. I thought everybody else was kind of going through the same thing. They just figured it out a little bit faster than I did. So it was just learning about it later on, it kind of made it click altogether. In terms of popular culture, we try to see that there are a lot of first gen narratives within comics, the superhero story. And the first gen stories were embedded into many of the comics early on. And comics were one of the main kind of media outlets for these first gen stories. In fact, some of the original creators of the comic books were first gen Americans. So first generation Jewish Americans and Italian immigrants coming in to kind of tell these stories. And the picture of stories that they were telling were stories of what was happening in real life. But we didn't have a way of kind of talking about these things and sharing these experiences. So through these illustrations, these depictions, we were able to see that humanity really is universal. I think one of the beautiful things about comics in general is that we're able to tell stories and break these barriers in terms of language, of levels of reading or whatever it might be, that you're able to really get a sense of what was happening at that time when that book or strip was made, of what was going on in that particular country, around the world, and really through the lens of somebody that we can relate to depending on the characteristics that were revealed of that character. So I think that's kind of the cool piece about these kinds of stories, that they keep popping up, and that's why we get so into these kinds of people and seeing ourselves in them as well.
Thank you. And this conversation today is about our lived experience as first gen individuals or alongside as allies to first gen individuals, and how we're seeing those identities and those narratives play out in fictional media. And we're realizing, as you're describing, there are historically very familiar stories that pop up in our lifetimes, in our upbringing, but also through the history of some of these important landscapes when it comes to comics and superheroes. I want to ask LT to talk a little bit about one aspect of this when it comes to the manifestation of the first gen identity and mentorship.
Sure. First, I want to ask, because Drea, you mentioned you dabble a little in Star Trek. If anybody else here dabbled in Star Trek or consider themselves a Trekkie, please let me know. I first want to say that, because my example is going to draw from the Star Trek world, is that I did not grow up as a Trekkie, and in fact, or engaged in Star Wars either. And I'll come back to this, but my point was that I didn't think that those stories were actually available to me. So it's much later in my life that I felt any kind of connection. But I was, had been the case prior to COVID, I was hanging out in Drea's office. Our offices are literally are next door to each other. And she had mentioned this character called Boothie. And Drea, I don't know if you remember, my mind just was blown, right? I was like, what? Missed the Boothie episodes. He's not in very many of them, actually. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Captain Picard and Boothie. I don't know. Again, I'd love to, if folks are familiar with this, please add your comments in the chat. But anyway, so first we have to talk about who Picard is before we get to Boothie and why the relationship is important. So Captain Picard, like one of the most renowned and esteemed captains of the Enterprise and in the Star Trek world. It's important to note that he does not come from a legacy of folks who had been to the academy. In fact, Picard, his legacy had been in the vineyard field. And so when he decided to go to the academy, it was a move away from what his parents had expected of him. So in effect, I'm arguing that he is first generation, right? To go on to have a different path than what's expected. But then there are these episodes, and we don't get to see these happen in real time. What we learn about his relationship with this character Boothie is told as he's older and reflecting back on his time in the academy. So Boothie is, we come to know, is the landscaper, the gardener of he's a human at the academy. So he's worked there for over 50 years. And at one moment, Picard says to another character, to Wesley Crusher, Boothie, is this really important figure in my life. And then, you start to wonder, and why why this person? What does this person mean to Picard? And how is it that in these moments where Picard had faced some kind of challenge in his life as a student, and even later on when he becomes a captain, he turns back to Boothie for support. And so I don't know about you guys, but that actually was my experience as a first generation student. I remember being at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, just nervous. I didn't speak to a single advisor, right? Didn't go to office hours. The one person I connected with was Mr. Stanley, and he was our custodian in our building. And so I would just, come back to my building and just casually talk to him about what's going on. And so I resonate with that relationship between Captain Picard and Boothie, that there's this person who seems so familiar to me. That's the type of work that my family did, that kind of blue collar physical labor, and someone who I thought could understand me. So I think Drea, when you talked about this moment of like it's a hard time, both in terms of the pandemic, in terms of social unrest, like who are we turning to? Who are our sources of support that we have to, that we draw upon to get our strength back? And so it's the Boothies in our world, it's the Mr. Stanleys of our world, So I think that that's really what's important to like tease out of some of these narratives that, again, Martha, I put in the chat. I love how you give that historical perspective of first gens and superheroes, and these really coming from telling other stories that weren't told at that time. So
thank you, LT. As you're speaking, I'm also reminded of this underground or unwritten manual, the practices, the mentorships, the folks we connect to, the community building that isn't in those official guidebooks, and how a lot of times we kind of had to create that, and as either as mentors or mentees, we're finding that that's how this works. In speaking of a journey, I want to ask Amanda to share with us, there's a long-standing narrative in literature that also helps speak to this experience of the individual who's going through uncharted waters and trying to build not just belongingness, but also a sense of who they are. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thanks, Drea. So first of all, I don't have a degree in literature or the hero's journey. I'm a neuroscientist, but these are the stories that have helped inspire me throughout my experiences in life. And so the hero's journey was essentially written by Joseph Campbell, and that's where George Lucas derived the formula for how he made Star Wars. And the hero with 1,000 faces, it's based off of a cycle of departure, initiation, and then return. And through the various parts of the journey, the reluctant hero goes on to an adventure, meets a crisis, has an experience, and then returns transformed. And the hero's journey it's not always, cyclical, but it's also relative. It's not just in one lifespan. You can make it relative to your whole life, but it could be about each different journey that you're on. I didn't know that I was a first gen until I was in my, maybe the middle of my second year of my PhD. And so I had been going through all this time to find answers to questions by secretaries or people that maybe friends that I had met at buying a coffee, or someone I made a joke with about, I saw them wearing a Star Wars shirt and I made a friend, right? And so finding those other navigation tools to get my way around. But anyhow, so I digress. The hero's journey is a story that I think anyone can relate themselves to at any part of their life, especially in context of first gen. And right now with this pandemic, the fall is coming. Are people going to go? And this is stage 2 of the hero's journey. This is where, they get the call to the adventure. And the second part is the refusal of the call. I mean, you think about Luke Skywalker doesn't want to go. And then he goes home and he sees his aunt and uncle are killed. So then he kind of has to go. So now our students, especially undergrad, first gen, who maybe their families want them to stay and it's in the family's interest for support, and there's this guilt and this feeling that you need to be there with them, but do you give up your journey? Do you turn away from the call? And Joseph Campbell writes about this being like such a crucial moment. Out of all the 17 steps of the hero's journey, if you don't go on number 2, if you refuse it and that's where you stay, it's like you just can't evolve in life. Thanks.
And as you've mentioned, I know as when we've talked about this before, there's so many components to that journey, and resilience is one of them. As you're talking about that, I'm thinking how crucial it is as we discover the hardships, as we discover kind of the turns and the decision making around, like, do I stay on this path? Which way do I go? Especially when I'm not sure who to turn to or who can help me through this. Resilience is a term that refers to an inherent ability, a capacity to learn from mistakes and setbacks and continue to build upon internal skills and ask for help. And that last piece, asking for help, is often it's missed. Resilience, it's not something that everyone just has. It's something that we all can build and we all can work on, just like a muscle. And so when we think of resilience as first gen, and when we think about resilience in pop culture, I kind of want to open it up to all three of you and ask how you see this manifest, how you see resilience coming up in the stories that were important to you. What did that look like?
Go ahead, Amanda. I'll go after you.
Thanks. When I think about resiliency, I actually looked up some of the literature about how people measure it, right? Because that to me is really interesting. And I found this really cool quiz. It's resiliencyquiz.com. I recommend looking it up if you're ever interested. And the reason I talk about that being important is because when you measure a concept, there's various dimensions of it. And so when I think of resiliency, it's not just this one thing that we are. It's these multi-dimensional things. So I picked a couple things that I liked out of there that I found that I could relate to, and I would try to relate to maybe a Star Wars story to tell you. One of my most, it could be argued this is first gen. I'm not sure what you guys want to say, but Yoda is a really good example. I mean, who are his parents? Where are they from? What's his story? We don't even know about the child. Okay.
Don't get me started with Baby Yoda. We have no idea about
I
their
tried to
history.
use Mandalorian, but who knows? I don't know. I mean, he could be a first generation Mandalorian, right? I mean, we could get into a whole other talk for this. But anyways, playful finding humor is one of the dimensions of resiliency. And I thought with Yoda, it was such a really cool example because he's always saying these things that you could probably think, oh, that's kind of funny, but it's so real. My favorite saying that Yoda says is the greatest teacher failure is. And that's finding it's funny because it's true, but it's something that so can resonate with anyone going through anything that challenge you and makes, the resiliency have to come up with whatever it is you're dealing with. So that would be my fandom relate. Going to mute. To you, LT.
You are so smart. My goodness. So first, I didn't mention my early fandoms. So shout out to Betty, Veronica, Archie, and Jughead, because those are my people. And so while their stories aren't about struggle, they connect to my first gen identity because there was this other world that I imagined myself in. And so it was the way that I coped with my situation, was placing myself in this other environment, and they were like my friends, And I remember, some of the old comics, you could like write in, and then you could like, you could send in outfits that you wanted Betty to wear. And I remember submitting for that, back in the 70s. And so that's a part of how I particularly, so for my own identity, is how I kind of hung into like tough situations. But some places where I see it goes back to the point I was making earlier about having felt very disconnected. Star Wars was to me the epitome of white boy, like not white men, like white boys. My Adam to Zachary, in the
Chad.
So I didn't think these stories were for me. I wasn't invited in. This is who I saw talking about the stories, and when I was in elementary school. It wasn't until The Force Awakens that I felt connected. And in particular, Rey and Dre, I think you're going to talk about this too, so I'll keep it brief. But Rey and Finn, and watching their storylines made me feel seen. So I feel very connected to Rey as a character. To Finn, I love this idea of Finn being a stormtrooper that wants to resist that, that this is how he grew up, but then he wants to turn away from it. That, basically he's giving up a privilege that he has. And so those like explicit narratives about resilience are what brought me into the Star Wars world. And it's so great to have a friend like Drea to tell you, nobody owns this. This is you. You can connect to it. It's important to have someone like that, to like a cheerleader to say, this is yours too. Drea being my Yoda to say, this don't see yourself outside of this.
I do want to talk a little bit about this, and then I'm going to shift to Martha to see if she wanted to add to this conversation. What you're pulling for me, the feelings I'm having right now, are around these relationships we have with narrative. especially fictional stories. And there is a term for this in psychology. We call them parasocial relationships. This is the non-delusional connection, the real but not real connection we have with Finn, with Rey, with Luke Skywalker, with Batman, and even, you know, maybe more real life characters that we're not connected to in real life. So this is that kind of very personal connection to somebody or to a story itself. And the other thing I want to say about that, which LT is drawing upon, is where is that tension? Because sometimes my relationship with a fandom or with a narrative, is uncomfortable or does create curiosity out of me. I grew up loving Star Wars, an initial story that was not about me, an initial story that I would even say, and I've said this at Comic-Con panels, I love a thing that doesn't love me back. So what is that tension? What is that dissonance I have to work through? Because guess what? I might work at an institution. I might work at an organization. I might be in a social situation where those feelings come up. And I've got to reckon with, what does that mean about my relationship with in this setting, at this landscape? I want to read a quote and ask, I'm going to ask Martha first about her response to this. One of my favorite components about our relationship with these narratives, as a psychologist, I'd say, is where we can learn emotionally, and is that tension. Media shows us in many ways how to address our own emotional sense and abilities, and also how to disrupt the narrative itself. Fan fiction is one of those ways where our culture repairs the damage done in a system where contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of the folk, right? Instead of us, the consumers, the fans, the community. And my quote is from Henry Jenkins, who's a professor of media studies at MIT, who says, "Fandom, after all, is born of a balance between fascination and frustration. If media content didn't fascinate us, there would be no desire to engage with it. But if it didn't frustrate us on some level, there would be no drive to rewrite it or remake it."
Is being recorded.
I think the one thing that stands out to me when you said the frustrations piece of it, it kind of makes us also look at ourselves, because there are pieces that we are trying to fix, that we're always trying to kind of tweak, and we're always trying to improve, as some might say, the areas of growth for ourselves from it. But I think that's what draws us into these characters, that it isn't, and it might seem a little boring if they already had the skill set, they already knew who to go to in terms of solving a problem or getting over a hurdle, whereas we can relate to them because we're not made that way. So even though these superheroes might have a superpower, or they have a knowledge that somebody else doesn't have, or they're able to relate to other people in a different way, I think they also remind us that we ourselves also have some superpower that we're able to utilize in these different capacities, whether it's an institution, an organization, corporation, whatever it might be. But we're able to draw upon those things, even if we too aren't perfect and people are trying to help us become a better version of ourselves.
Can I add to that, Drea? Real
Of
quick?
course.
I think, because I don't think I've ever talked about why the Flash for me. I remember, so I have really great eye-hand coordination. I have really quick hands. And I remember someone was commenting on that. It was a long, long time ago. And like, oh man, I wish, you should do something with that. And I was like, what kind of superpower is that, to like catch something really quickly? Like I really dismissed it. And then I started watching The Flash. I was like, oh my God, it was a superhero all based on being fast, right? And I think it's a good example of how we can sometimes dismiss the things, that the gifts that we've been given, and like, oh no, but he's not like Superman, or we want to attribute, we want to give someone else or lift them up in their gifts, and not own the thing that we have, And so I had that moment of recognition, like, what? We have the same kind of gift. I'm not fast, that kind of fast, but you know what I mean? Like I saw someone who was similar to me, and that he was elevated for that. So that was part of my connection there.
Thank you. I want to kind of tie some of these things together, and I know we've been Star Wars leaning, so I'm going to give another Star Wars example, but perhaps we can add some variety to this. as we're talking about representation in pop culture narratives and sometimes our real need to have a connection, have a relationship, or some familiarity, this idea that if I see it on screen, I'm validated, my experience has value, right? That's such a meaningful thing for us in development, right? Adrienne Rich calls the lack of that experience psychic disequilibrium, meaning like it's like looking to a mirror and not seeing yourself, right? So that tension again of our thirst to be a part of those fictional narratives, all of us knowing that those fictional narratives and media set the tone, set the standard for what's right, what's good, what's affirmed. And so I know that's important. When I got to know Rey, especially after The Last Jedi, there was a lot of criticism toward her. Well, she can't be that smart. Well, she can't know that many languages. Well, she didn't go to the academy, so how does she have all these abilities? All these different attacks that reminded me of some of my experiences. You know, how many languages I speak and how I speak them. Where did I learn how to do, certain things? How was I so self-sufficient? And when I look at Rey's journey and how the story is told to us, there's actually a lot of explanation. She's, yes, she's a scavenger. She's learned how to speak with different communities. She's learned how to barter. She's learned how to be very efficacious in her own experience. She has intuition. She has lived experience, and she accesses resources in different ways. Now, even though she has this impressive motivation and self-focus, she didn't have the things that someone like Kylo Ren had in terms of like the standard institutionalized mentorship in the Jedi Academy, the learnings and teachings that someone would have, in that family. I mean, there's this whole legacy piece, right? This concept of, when I heard the comment of like, you're nothing, this idea that, coming from nowhere, what identity is that? And before the story had more explanation in The Rise of Skywalker, which I'm not sure we're going to get into, that uplifted my experience because I felt like I didn't have to have the same experience as others in this country as a child of immigrants to succeed. I felt like I could be seen and valued. And Rey really gave me that sense of, my resilience and my abilities can come from within and from my lived identity, not from heritage, bloodline, money, institutionalized forms of this. So I wonder, how folks, whether you're seeing this in other stories.
Like the bloodline part?
Any part of this as far as like you're seeing kind of that first gen piece come through in a fictional narrative.
Well, one piece going back to the same Archie and Betty and Veronica stuff, same LT growing up, reading those as well. It reminds me of Jughead and his story of growing up in a lower socioeconomic class than the rest of the group, right? So if we think about him and going to school, and then you're surrounded by folks who might be talking about, well, where are you applying to college? As a first gen student, just the thought about, well, what do I need to do to even apply? Thinking about just the experiences too. What are you involved in any extracurriculars? Well, if I'm holding more than one job and I have to support the family, I might not be able to participate in extracurriculars, which we know are important for college applications. So just thinking back into what you were saying, it reminded me of his story of trying to negotiate both family life and the dissonance between going back to school and being surrounded by folks who come from different backgrounds, where he was trying to fit in as well.
LT, I want to ask you, in the work that you do, there's a lot of advising, there's a lot of storytelling. I mentioned this, we often talk about this hidden curriculum, right? And so I'm wondering, how does, whether it's storytelling, whether it's fictional media or pop culture, are there ways in which you delve into this realm in your advising and mentorship?
Ooh, man, so many things going on in my head right now. Yeah, you had earlier alluded to this concept of the hidden curriculum, right? These things where that one is expected to know. And oh my, Paul, don't do this to me. Do not bring Friday Night Lights into this. We'll be here all night. We'll be here all night. These things were supposed to have just somehow organically found out, right? That gets passed down. I want to bring Black Panther into this because one of the things I've appreciated about that movie is that it's showing tension within the group. It's not simple, like the white villain character is actually a marginal character. The tension is within the Black community, right? And I so appreciate the Killmonger character because he is speaking on behalf of the first gen folks, right? So while he has a blood lineage to T'Challa, he wasn't raised in the same way, right? He's raised outside of the country. He doesn't know his heritage, right? He feels it, but he doesn't know it exactly because it's been cut off from him after his father is killed, right? And so I joked about this before. I remember watching this story, and at some point they describe his background. It was like, yeah, he went to MIT and he's like Navy SEAL. And I'm thinking this boy was orphaned, essentially, right? So my thought was, okay, what upward bound program was he in to get there? Because that doesn't just happen on your own. And so the confrontation, I'm always fascinated to see him, like when he arrives in Wakanda, and he's having to like very quickly it's again, there's a connection, but he has to very quickly acculturate, right? And part of his challenge is that he resists that acculturation. He wants to kind of take it over. And it always frustrates me that he dies, So the legacy folks like T'Challa, where the movie in some ways is oriented for us to cheer for T'Challa, right? But then you think T'Challa is in his own land. He's got his father that he can draw upon, and Eric doesn't really have that. So I think there's that part of me that continues to root for Eric, because I once again really see my story and his story and how he's just had to navigate and figure things out on his own. So I think there's so much richness in that movie.
I'm gonna ask Amanda to talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling in our communication, but I do want to uplift some of the comments that are in the chat right now that really highlight the narrative of POC superheroes and really the hero holding an identity that we don't often see in the spotlight, and the importance of that that journey and seeing ourselves as being centered in a story. Because often, whether it's Archie or some of the stories that we've grown to love in our childhood, especially, I'll speak for myself as a child of immigrants from South America. I didn't see myself in these narratives, and I was in love with superheroes in comics and held an expectation that I would probably never see somebody like me being centered in that story. I've grown, though, to realize that my storytelling, the way that I share science, the way that I translate what I know, whether as an advisor or psychologist or scientist, that it's important in my role to advise students in higher education, to advise the public through social media, through my social media platforms. And I know, Amanda, we are really curious and draw upon this empowerment around storytelling, that storytelling can be really impactful. What can you share about the importance of conveying science through imagination and emotions?
I love that. I started looking into the scientific literature around storytelling and science just because, like, what's PubMed gonna say about it? And I found a really cool study at MIT talking about why the need for storytelling is so important. And it was so creepy of how it was eerie. It was Twilight Zone. Drea, you would love that. It was Twilight Zone, how accurate it would be to apply right now in a pandemic. And as a nurse, you know, saying it, the need for effective storytelling is especially important in the scientific community. The study had said when large sections of society are used to relying on misinformation and biased data, pointing to scientific facts is not effective. So when you live in a time right now where the news, everything's red, you know, danger, the world's ending, the sky is falling, who are you going to believe? Because I love memes. One of my friends, Aphrodite, she's in here. I'm so glad you joined and to watch. She had posted about, let's hurry up and open school so we can send our kids back and not listen to them, you know, essentially. And it's sad. It makes me sad to think that how powerful it is right now for the need for storytelling. So that was really what I got from it, how powerful it is to make the story accessible, especially academia accessible, so the public or people could learn from their experience. That's what I love about watching TED Talks and having the opportunity to talk about any knowledge or research in a public forum, because it shouldn't be behind closed doors in an ivory tower. Anyone should be able to access it and ask a question. Because if, you know, all of us academics, we're here because we love it. So that's part of the need to not just carry the evidence or truth or whatever it is that the knowledge you have, but the need to be heard and validated in a safe space, particularly right now, in context of being a nurse in the pandemic. Yeah, so, 100 days from election. So.
I don't know if we want to keep bringing that up or not. I just wanted to add to that and ask, I wonder how many people know that Albert Einstein was first generation college, Sigmund Freud, first generation college, and sometimes we mistakenly believe, oh, back then everyone was first gen. That's not the case. There are more people who have access to education now than when they were in school. And even Einstein being the child of immigrant parents who didn't have an opportunity to go to college in their home country, and his father making sure that his son had those opportunities. Or in the case of Freud, he was the favored son. He was the golden child. He was known as Golden Siggy, in fact, in his family. And he was like given a special room so that he could study. And I think some of us can identify with those things too. But imagine if we talked about them as first-gen students. We don't. We jump right to the moment of their brilliance and not think about, and of course they're brilliant all along, but all that other stuff is ignored. And I think to tie this together with science and narrative and first gens, that many of us would think really differently about our own identities, or we might reach some people sooner in the sciences if they made that positive connection. We all often jump right to where someone got their PhD and not paid attention to the community college that they went to before they got there. And really, that's where the credit belongs, not with Harvard.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the time that I was dropped off at the curb at college with my suitcases and said goodbye to my parents, and they flew back. This was in upstate New York at Cornell University. I'm a SoCal girl, never really seen snowfall, never really been in a college town. And the imposter syndrome was overwhelming. And I carried these beliefs that I don't belong in this place. No one has my experience. There must have been a mistake, and spent every second working toward keeping up and trying to hide and even wrestling with shame around whether I really belonged in this institution. And I see that, especially as folks share stories about Black Panther and Spider-Man and superheroes and comics, we often see in the origin story a similar experience of questioning. Am I supposed to be a superhero? I don't know how to use this power. I don't know what power, what this even looks like. Miss Marvel is one of these examples where several years ago in the comics, she gained superpowers, and this, some folks are familiar with Carol Danvers, who we see in the Marvel movies. Like this is the white blonde woman who is Miss Marvel in the movies, but in the comics, Miss Marvel is Kamala Khan. She's first generation Muslim American teenager. And when I talk about her powers, I say that she encounters her powers. Like they just sort of, she evolves during teenagehood. And as she encounters these powers, she realizes that she can morph her body. And her first representation of a superhero is to turn into a white blonde lady, because this is how she feels a superhero should look like and should behave. And even to the extent of height and weight and body image. And as she like tries to work within that body and use her superpowers, she realizes it feels inauthentic, and that she doesn't actually know how to thrive and even how to help other people. So she begins to I would say, like, morph back into her identity and come to an understanding that her superpower really is an innate ability and not so much what she thinks she's supposed to be. And so as I hear and read about superhero identity, I wonder what folks can talk about in terms of imposter syndrome and that piece. That's a part of the hero's journey, which is like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here, or if this is for me. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
When I talked about that resiliency quiz, one of the scales they measure on is authenticity. Did I say that right? Authenticity. You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think that that's extremely meaningful. There's this really great nonfiction book by Robert Greene called Mastery, and he talks about these amazing, innovative, game-changing scientists or businessmen, and he talks about them each building their careers based off of a collective sum of all of their life experiences. And the crucial thing is that, to me, the mark of their resiliency was their ability to stay authentic through even failure, through tough or good, even especially when things were really good, right? Because that's the moment things can really fall apart, when you least expect it. But that was, to me, the resiliency was the authenticity. So I just want to say that.
I think when we think back to the first gen identity, when we try to emulate to see, well, that's whatever that person did, like you mentioned with the character, how they dress or look like, if we do that, it's going to lead to these results. But I think at the point where, as first gens, when we end up getting a positive result on something by just being ourselves, it's kind of like a rude awakening for us to also think, I could be myself and still excel, and I don't need to look, wear, feel a certain way to be able to do that. But similar to superheroes, it's to have to go through the challenges of not only with yourself to try to say, I'm going to put myself out there and be a little bit more vulnerable with folks, but to also recognize that that is empowering, and you're also having people behind you too, or you're not alone. I think that's something that resonates with many of the superhero stories and popular culture in general, is that there are people along for the ride, along for the journey, that the person is never isolated. So similar to our students, where they themselves aren't alone. They have a community that is in for the ride.
LT's like, no, keep going. Another comic.
They said it all.
I love it. I want to just say, there's another comic called Quince, which is a graphic novel about a Latina girl who gets her superpowers only during her quinceañera. So it's just a very limited time, and she learns about it like the day before. And her abuelita, as you're talking about, like, who has our back? Like, there's got to be a Yoda. Like, who's your Yoda? So in Quince, abuelita is sharing, oh, right, by the way, you have superpowers. You're only going to have them for a year. You get it during your quinceañera. It's normal for us in our family. And, by the way, like, outside our family, it's not normal. So, there's that dropped on you. You're different. You're unique. But it's a part of your excellence. And so Lupe, who's the main character of the story, is learning of this nearly the day that she gains these powers, and is working toward, you know, some of these themes that we're talking about in the origin story, which is like, okay, how do I sit with these powers, and how do I use them effectively, and how do I identify now that I know that I have these abilities? There's this, I wonder who can talk about that as a first gen, because I know this has come up in first gen narratives and in dialogue. How do you wrestle with being empowered and having then the knowledge that you have that maybe abuelita doesn't have? So, you know, what does that feel like and look like in your experiences?
Man, so many ways to address that. I think that is one of the inherent tension, can be a really inherent tension with the first generation identity at all. Like, part of the idea of even saying first gen is that you are doing something, you're headed toward a path that's very different than the folks who raised you, right? Typically your parents, but your birth parents, but could be, you know, just the community in general. And so what I encourage folks to do, because there's a whole body of literature, Rodriguez, that talks about like the negative in that. So I try to encourage the positive, so that you have to. I encourage students to honor whatever it was that their parents or family members did, even if they're going in a different direction. This actually is the Picard story, right? You don't want to say, oh my gosh, working in a vineyard is trash. One could argue his family worked in a vineyard so that he could go on to be captain, right? And so that's another way to look at it, is your family, your community, doing what they did in order to get you to a different place. And so, and Amanda and I have talked about this quite a bit, that doesn't mean those tensions go away.
Yeah.
So that's something that one has to continue to wrestle with quite a bit. And it's up to everybody handles that very differently. I know for me, I'm so hyper aware that my experience is very different than my family's experience. So the way I deal with it is I don't talk very much about what I do or the fact that I have a PhD. Like, I completely downplay that. I'm sure Amanda, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I don't really share much about I feel like I've also done a lot of really different stuff, military and then PhDs. And my family's like, what, like, you know, first gen from even that is kind of crazy. So I think for me, it's the knowledge that they're going to support me and they love me no matter what, but I have to believe in myself. And, you know, I have to accept that they did the best that they could with themselves, and that there's no judgment. It's not about me, about how I carry the experience. It's up to me to have composure and just have love, you know, not be afraid and not be not have any resentment, I guess.
I think for me, it's been hearing family stories, and even though they may not have had the same educational experience, it's picking up skills or ways that they dealt with certain things that I might be seeing in the work setting and just any other kind of relationship type of setting. But thinking, well, that's how they dealt with it. Well, can I use some of what worked for them for myself? So even though it's not, I guess, formalized education, but they were able to do things that maybe it's a similar challenge that I'm having, that I'm able to still learn from them. So I think that piece is also valuable for first gens to advocate too, in the way that they approach certain things in the beginning, is to really kind of reach back and see, like, so what did my grandma do or my grandfather do, and how did were they able to overcome whatever barrier was in their way? Again, not in the same exact formalized setting, but education setting, but still, what can I utilize in terms of the way they thought about something, the way approach something? And I think that's also what superheroes do too. They look for the good in humanity, right? So whether they're having a horrible encounter with something evil, or they're just having trouble with themselves too as they're going through their growing up process. It's really kind of seeing the good in things. And I think that's one thing that kind of resonates throughout them. We may not agree on everything. We may not see the same everything the same way, but we're all still able to see the good in something.
The superhero burden is also the profound amount of care that the individual hero is involved in. So care of the community, care of family members, even the tension of the double identity or dual identity. How does the first gen identity manifest here? You know, I don't know if code switching is the most accurate term for me, but I'll notice, like LT saying, you know, I might speak differently about I mean, I might speak about completely different things and speak differently when I'm with my family of origin, who again are immigrants from South America and haven't had the experience like me, being the only person of my background in a cohort and PhD program. And those experiences shaped me. And then how then am I overly protective? And in what ways am I having to take care, you know, as folks are talking about their this generation and feeling the pressure of taking care of the community or taking care of family members, not even emotionally necessarily, but financially, in terms of knowledge sharing, in terms of the climate in this country, and how we are experiencing multiple threats in various ways. So I've said a lot there, but I'm wondering if any of you can kind of pick up on some of the themes of dual identity or holding the burden of taking care of others, and how you're like, how do you resolve those tensions?
I can take a quick stab because I love Jessica and Fabiola's questions in the chat, because I think they're speaking to one another. Because I think one thing is important to say, that we also don't want to romanticize the first gen identity, like, oh, you're a superhero, you know, where everyone's a complex, nuanced individual with complex stories, right? So we want to really honor that and know that a lot of this is individualized. And it's also true, Fabi, that I would argue that not all of our families consider us as heroes of what we're doing, that there are moments where folks may say, you think you're better than me, or you know, or how dare you, or, you know, all kinds of things. So I guess I wanted to name that. And then, and yet, and still, I think I'll speak for myself, that always thinking about my family and what I have versus what they have, and any differences. And I suspect those tensions will be heightened during this time. And so there's some of us who are really tired of working from home. And, you know, I was doing an ergonomic evaluation right before here. But then how many of us have family members that don't have an option to work from home? They are considered an essential worker because they work at Home Depot, not because they're a doctor, right? And so those are some of the things that many of us have to live with.
Yeah, so many of the comments in the chat are resonating. The idea of like, well, I thought you studied so much. Shouldn't you know this? Like, I thought you're a doctor. Like, shouldn't you be able to know this information and know everything about everything? But it is also the complexity of, like LT mentioned, that there's so many, obviously the intersecting identities, but also the expectations that comes with each of these identities, right? So whether it's a cultural expectation of having to do things by a certain age, or a gender expectation too as well. So it's a lot of layers that we're working through. But like LT said, we're not trying to say that it's all like a happy fairy tale being a first gen student.
I'm thinking about the dichotomies and tensions of choice. So if you choose to be in school for, you know, 6, 7, 8 years, are you delaying other practices and culturally approved, culturally expected life choices or life changes that may mean delaying starting a family or not having children at all. And so, you know, as a married person with no children and no plans to have children, I do wonder about the notion of, have I fulfilled the plan? Like, what was the plan?
What was the
Is this
plan?
okay? You know, what can I get an evaluation? Like, what is my grade here? How did I do? That's another tension that I experience.
And then also for shout out to those folks who were in college or in school and back home, and now even more so educating their younger siblings or other folks in the family, like taking on that role of the teaching during the pandemic, right? So that probably was may have been an expectation before, but now it's even more of an expectation for those folks. So I just, you know, we have to acknowledge that stuff.
Absolutely. I see that some very helpful questions were coming in. So at this time, I do want to ask folks in the chat room to continue putting those questions in there for us to discuss, or add some comments of your own personal experiences as well, as that's been helpful to read. We've sort of touched upon some of the complexities, right? The nuances that not every experience is challenging, but also not every first-gen experience is harmonious, and that within the family dynamic, I'm seeing different experiences, and there were some questions, or there was a question that did come in about rejecting the hero. I don't know, Amanda, if this is a part of the hero's journey, but what can you say about this experience for community rejection, family rejection, the sense of the individual hero really wanting to take on the identity, but not feeling that it's embraced?
That's a very complex, multi-layered question, Drea. It's not really an exact part of the hero's journey that you're saying of the rejection, unless you want to put it into context of that being the journey, that being the problem. So it really has to do with probably in the heroes going through the journey to, how do I say this? It not being about approval of other people. Like that's not the journey. Like that's the important thing to focus on, because when you start to think about approval, validation, you just go down this path of my happiness equates to someone else's subjective numerical score of what I am worth. And so I think it's important to think about, especially as first gen, because those are the things you don't really, I don't identify as a hero. I don't identify as first gen being anything as a superhero. I just have always looked at stories of narratives like Superman not belonging. And that was my narrative for me as a kid, seeing, oh, he doesn't feel like he fits in. I don't feel like I fit in either, you know? I mean, I couldn't fly, wish, but so anyway, my point is that it just really depends on what the person defines as their journey. And as we get older, you get the emotional intelligence and what is important changes in our life, and how we respond to crisis. And let's not forget, right now is a crisis. Things are going to be different. I was trying to talk to my advisor earlier about something in 4 weeks, and I'm like, well, hopefully the world will still be standing, you know? Okay, thanks.
Your friends are saying you actually can fly, which I believe.
But you know what, Drea, for the Hamilton fans that are here, I think that's also a first generation narrative, and I think it's really helpful to look at it through that lens. I know there's valid critiques about whose history is being represented, but it's also just as valid to see how it's disturbing that narrative at the same time. And Hamilton, if you look, he does not, his whole part of his struggle is actually not fitting in, right? And so he's seeking community, and then you can argue when he gets it in the first half, it's destroyed by the second half, right? But it's a really interesting narrative to pay attention to when you do think of it in those first gen lenses, you know, and how do you put it, Amanda? Like his the trajectory is when his mom dies, right? So he is it's that same Clark Kent, like my parents are dead, I'm going to this new foreign place, I don't quite fit in, you know, I'm trying to like Americanize myself, but then it's not really, you know, it's an interesting story from that lens.
I'm thinking about as we kind of go into maybe one of the last sections here in our conversation about some practical takeaways. And I know that LT, I'll just say, I know that you've been able to use pop culture and fictional stories to begin conversations in our department, to bring people together, to talk about, let's say it's Black Panther, or a film that's come out, or even a music video. When This Is America came out, you reached out to folks and said, you know, let's talk about, this is a narrative. Let's talk about this narrative. Like, what are we seeing and how are we experiencing? This is, you know, as a psychologist, I really want to champion that learning and say that storytelling really is an emotional process. So when I disclose, when I share, when I tell my story, there's a neurobiological response in my body. There's a stress reduction response in my body. There is a healing process that happens where I experience affirmation. I experience calmness. I experience being seen and validated, right? And so there's also a process for the other person listening to a story. There is connection, there is growth, there's learning, there's empathy, which is also neurobiological, but also a part of their continued resilience and lived experience. So I'm wondering, you know, I gave one practical way to engage stories, which, as I've mentioned, LT and I might build a time and place, and we'll begin talking about a story and talk about how that story has impacted us or what it brings out in us. I'm wondering, for the three of you in your work, whether it's based on something that you do or something that your advisors and mentors have done, where have you seen storytelling give students an opportunity to learn in these ways? And this is where art and narrative meet, right? This is where art and science meet. So I'm wondering what your practical advice is on this.
I'm happy to kick it off. Number one, just valuing story is the first thing. And I can use the Star Wars model as Star Wars as an example, that when we think about if fandoms were higher ed or disciplines, then Star Wars arguably is the canon, right? It's the Shakespeare of fandoms. And some of us, because we're felt outside of it, or you know, just weren't as fluent in it, can feel like, well, maybe I don't know it as well. You know, what I'm interested in isn't as important because it's not Star Wars, right? Or you can be a fan of Star Wars, but your connection to it is different. Or you might just like a whole other fandom, like, oh, but it's not Star Wars, so maybe what I like isn't important, right? So that's just an important concept altogether to grapple with. This is what I was struggling with in graduate school. I too, like Amanda, didn't really connect to my first-gen identity until my doctorate program, because there I was with folks whose parents, to this day, it still blows my mind that people have parents with PhDs. And if you're a first-gen college student, you're like, what? And so I had to, again, value my own narrative. I'll speak to my own college student, and that is my daughter, who will be a sophomore in college this fall. And I've been pushing on her my new favorite show, which is BoJack Horseman, because it's doing some really has some really compelling narratives about mental health and wellness. And in some ways, seeing the way it's presented is an easier entree, so to speak, than if I say, look at this workbook, right? So I feel like because it's funny, because it's colorful, all kinds of things happening, it's a good way to introduce some really, really important topics as well. And so that's often how I've introduced a lot of major themes in my own teaching with students. But I was so happy my daughter told me just today, like, oh, I started watching BoJack, you were right. I was like, I know I was right. But I kept that part to myself. I can't do that. BoJack Horseman, Michelle, I'll put it in. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Sarah backed me up.
I'm thinking about the various ways in which, well, I'll say two things. One is that superheroes were a part of my imposter syndrome, that because I had these strong affinities and because they were about comics and superheroes and sci-fi and fantasy and games, I felt that those weren't mature experiences. Those weren't mature identities to bring to the PhD table, so to speak. So I was quite, one of the pressures I felt was to keep those affiliations and to keep those passions like so low key, like almost to the point where I felt a dissonance in my identity. I couldn't be authentic, as Amanda was talking about. That authenticity was lacking through my experience through my graduate program. And so now that I'm somewhat free of that, I'm not completely free of imposter syndrome, but I'm free of that particular concern. I utilize, my office and in my home office, I have Star Wars pictures and action figures, and I ask students, what's your fandom? What's your favorite story? What's your favorite TV show? And I remember one student saying that Pirates of the Caribbean was like his favorite show, and Jack was like the main pirate. I don't even know the story, and I'm just like, I don't even know anything about the story. And this is like, what? And then I asked him, tell me why you like this character. Well, Jack Sparrow is outwardly weird and strange and kind of like seemingly aloof, but actually truly is a different way internally. And as his connection started to unfold, then we started to connect a little bit more. And I learned that we don't have to share the exact same fandom or the exact same connection for us to learn about each other. And what I often say about my work in public health or in public health education is that this is a good starting point, that this is not just a way to accelerate important conversations, that if I walk down the street and I see Amanda also has a Star Wars shirt, that accelerates our connection in such a meaningful way. We can start talking about that. But it also means that it can be a safe start. It can be a safe way to open dialogue. And this is what I do with my podcast about Batman. It starts about Batman, who's a fictional character and he has a lot of troubles. But that then leads into conversations about trauma recovery and grief and loss and PTSD and suicide, which I want people to know about. And there's no reason that this can't be knowledge that the public has. This is all information. This is all science that everyone can know about. And from my perspective, everyone should know about. So that's kind of the piece there that I feel pop culture elevates us and allows us to use it as a grounds for learning and connection. But then how do we deal with the toxicity? So as LT was talking about the landscape of Star Wars, there's that extra piece that this is territory that's toxic. And so what happens when that fandom becomes a toxic ground for us? What are the different ways that we can handle the toxicity? I see this in Harry Potter fandom. I see this in Star Wars and Star Trek fandom. This has been on our minds a lot recently because of the connections between the creators of these things, of these stories, and their beliefs. So Martha, can you talk a little bit about how to handle and what to do with the toxicity that we might have to encounter in this landscape?
I think that's like to touch on the previous point you also mentioned, the ways to utilize all, whether it's like you mentioned, a movie, a TV show. It's a good way to kind of introduce these challenges. In terms of the toxicity, I think that's also the reason why these subgroups have emerged, right? So who's continually being pushed out? It reminds me of kind of like our student organizations on campus, where we do have a broader scope of, let's say, like a medical organization, but they may not be attuned to certain ideas, backgrounds, whatever it might say. So a group might decide to do a subgroup of Latinos, Latinx for medical professions. So I think that's one way that folks have started to deal with the toxicity within this broader environment, is to kind of create a smaller community of like-minded folks, might be similar background folks, where you can still carry on that fandom, the career trajectory, whatever it might be that you're interested in, but have a space where you're allowed to be you. So, but it is also having these harder conversations with the much larger community of, we need to work on this. We can't just keep creating these subcommunities, but we do need to bring it back and deal with, this is a challenge for what we're doing, what's going on here. And we do need to call it out for what it is. And it usually takes, it might be a hero to take the first step for others to kind of align with them, to start having these kinds of conversations and willing to call things out by what they are, not skirting around the issue, which we tend to do. I know for myself, when I have these difficult conversations, whether it's in the classrooms, with staff meetings, I've noticed we bring up a lot of popular culture to kick off a meeting. And that's the way that we all kind of bring ourselves together and ground ourselves. Then we start talking about some challenges or problems we have to address at the institution. In class, another strategy that I use too is, if you're able to do so, is to wear t-shirts with different characters that you like. I know that's all, like you mentioned, Drea, that's been helpful for me to have connections with students that way too, who'll say, hey, I like your shirt. Oh, I didn't know you watched that too. And just having that connection from them, that really grounds students to see you as a person too. So I think that's also helpful, just not in addition to having the conversations, but also visibly recognizing that you're very similar to them, even though you may not have a similar background.
Drea, you had said something about, you had asked each of us to say a piece about how we felt we could do storytelling with what we do. And for me, it's when you teach students, even if it's one-on-one or in a group setting, those are the icebreakers. You tell these narratives. I love to tell like sea stories, Navy stories, nursing stories, all these different other experiences, but it's the pop culture. When I was as a nurse, working as a nurse, when I was in the military, it's the pop culture stories that everyone wants to share. And you kind of find like a sense of belonging tribe through the stories. So that's what I want to share.
You're reminding me that I bounce from question to question. So thank you for pivoting back to that. And I'm applauding Martha too for talking about the conversations, the difficult conversations. So if I can see fandom being tumultuous sometimes, and being the fandom itself being a social place of gatekeeping, toxicity, in-group, out-group tension, questions and curiosity about belongingness, that also manifests on campuses in certain ways. How do students find their belongingness? And when we see that tension, I was typing in-group versus out-group as you were talking, like when either student organizations or more institutionalized groups from the campus come together and find community, where do the same dynamics build, and how do we kind of see some of those parallels? I wonder too, as we're talking about some of the practical things that we do, how to kind of build upon that. And one thing I do want to say too is that sometimes we're going to see we're going to see it happen in the stories before we see it happen in our lives. And so I also want to bridge that, that sometimes we bring up narrative and identity because in pop culture, because that's the way that we want to be, or that's the way that we want to see things. Star Trek is a pop culture landscape that was one of the first, Twilight Zone, one of the first to bring up the notion that that if we can visualize it this way, that we can begin to move our society in a very positive way. With that, I want to end this discussion with anything that the panelists want to add as far as any, again, any solutions or strategies they use, as well as where we can find you. So your preference for how folks here can locate you in social media or websites or emails. So I'm going to start, Martha, with you, and then I'll move my way over.
I would say just to continue telling your story. I think the more people hear about what goes on, I know like LT mentioned that we only sometimes hear about first gens in terms of like when they make it big or when something good happens, something positive, but we have to be real and acknowledge the process of it. I know there's been some, I can't recall if it's a meme or some sort, with the glacier image of we just see the excellence at the top, but all the stuff at the bottom in terms of the growth, the building, the networking, the connections that had to happen aren't really acknowledged. So I want to encourage people to, whether it's writing your own story, sharing your own story visibly. We know that comics are being utilized to teach math, history, all sorts of different topics. But I would encourage folks to be a little bit more creative and flexible and vulnerable, to share as much as you're comfortable sharing, but to share that with other people. Because we all have a lot of good knowledge to share with one another, and we can all learn with one another.
Thank you. And how can folks find you? What's the best way to connect with you?
Sure, I'll put my email in the chat box, but email's the quickest way.
Awesome. Amanda.
Have some self-compassion. I found a writing group that I meet with and literally will check in and say, I checked my email today. So right now, while it's a pandemic and people are working from home and, you know, you're seeing people post, I'm going to do like the keto challenge and do a marathon. Be kind to yourself and have some self-care with space and grace of, you know, eating healthy, getting some sleep, and just being kind to yourself right now. That's all.
Thank you. And how can folks find you?
So I am on Instagram, on Facebook. Instagram is @amanda.egloff, or you can reach me by email, and I will
drop it in the chat.
Thanks.
Awesome. LT.
Yeah, I'll just build upon what Amanda said in terms of it's okay to take a break. There was a moment where there was just a convergence of too many things going on with Black Lives Matter, with the pandemic, et cetera, just overall stress, where I just kind of checked out from social media for a bit. And it was probably one of the best things I did for myself. And then I came back, like, just revived again. There are those moments, whether it's full-on depression or just a moment of anxiety or stress, where you feel like you're always going to feel that way. And the key is knowing that that doesn't have to be the case. And so I was like, I'm stuck. I don't know what to post on First Gen and Juice anymore. This is stupid. Like, I went through all the things. Why am I posting about comics right now is really what I said. So the part 2 to that is make sure you check in with your squad. So have a squad, have those people who are there to cheer you on. And sat down with some folks, and they sort of affirmed for me like what it was I was doing in that platform. I did put the handle in the chat. I can put it in there again. So @FirstGen and Juice is the Instagram and the Twitter that really focuses on first gen representation in pop culture. So that is my life force. That's the thing that keeps me going. So whatever that is for you, it doesn't have to be that thing. Whatever it is, definitely lean into it. Thanks, Martha.
Thank you, LT. What I'll say in closing out here is that we've been talking about how we're inviting pop culture discussion and dialogue into higher education and into our kind of academic roles. I want to ask folks here, the call to action too is to bring higher education and academics and our backgrounds as advisors and educators into pop culture spaces. This is where we can, it's where a lot can happen. Our experiences are validated there as well, but we also begin to connect with others in the fandom who may not have opportunity or connection to learn about some of these different themes. So for instance, there's, right now we're experiencing Comic-Con at home, which is the virtual version of Comic-Con. And while I'm upset that I can't go to Comic-Con, I'm so excited that it's free and accessible and all these panels can come into all of your homes. And so that also means that folks in the fandom can learn from educators and folks in higher education like us, so they can learn about these different strategies, where the literature we're talking about, the science we're talking about, the roles that we have in our lives, and they can get inspired by that. And I think that that's kind of a nice way to integrate these different realities. So as an example, for instance, one of the Comic-Con panels, I'm not on it, but one of the Comic-Con panels is about Watchmen and masks, and the such a current topic, such an interesting perspective to take, and invites people to talk about some really important issues. I'm plugging my panel this year, which is all about the psychology of Star Wars and Star Trek. No surprises there, but it's a healthy debate between the two fandoms and whether psychological science is represented better in Trek or Wars. So there's the plug for that. You can find me. I'll plug in my Instagram and Twitter in the chat room as we say goodbye. But for everybody, I do want to say thank you for being here and having this conversation with us and creating some space that is positive, harmonious, uplifting, and brings in some really cool ideas to our everyday lives.
And thank you, Drea, for being a fantastic moderator as always.
Yes, thank you, Drea.
Yes, thank you, Drea. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks all.
Yay! That was awesome. I'll be sure to share the link.
Thank you. Did Amanda peace out? I just wanted to stay back and say thank you so much for keeping the conversation going. And there were times when I would pause because I'm listening and learning from many of you. So just appreciate this, and I'm excited to share the link with everybody.
Well, I look forward to I'm going to watch a video for Batgirls this weekend probably.
Awesome.
Yeah. Cool.
Same. I was like, oh yeah.
Wait, Saturday there's one on Picard, so that's on my to-do list.
Yeah, I started.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I started watching the mask one.
Oh.
Yeah, and they were just like the different, looking at masks, not just what we're wearing for protection, but the masks that we wear as individuals in society. I was going down a good rabbit hole, but then I'm like, oh shoot, I have to come back on.
Yeah, David Surratt, from University of Oklahoma, he's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, I gotta end this video though, otherwise they'll hear everything we're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Bye.
Bye.